Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've come to associate these oversight hearings with very colorful and sometimes lurid titles about government overreach and water grabs and things like that. So I was kind of surprised to see this very technical academic title today, Innovations in Safety Since the 2010 Macondo Incident. I didn't even know what the Macondo Incident was. It turns out the majority's messaging department has once again been very on message. The message with this milestone anniversary of the tragic Deepwater Horizon spill is to not talk about that spill. In fact, we're even renaming it. We're calling it the Macondo Incident. And we're going to talk euphemistically and wishfully about all the advances in innovation that have made deepwater drilling and other exploration safe now. It's a great attempt at messaging, but unfortunately, it's not very accurate. There's a lot that we could be saying on this milestone about what happened with the Deepwater Horizon rig. We could be talking about the inherent dangers of oil drilling and exploration, the loss of life that continues to happen, the exploding trains that we're experiencing all too often around the country, the inherent environmental damage and risk that we see with our unhealthy reliance on oil. We could talk about the full extent of the environmental damage from the Deepwater Horizon spill. We could talk about the barrier islands in Louisiana that have eroded and begun to disappear because of the loss of vegetation as the mangroves were encased in oil. I was watching a show last night where somebody took a boat up to one of these islands, and just the propeller action from that boat started stirring up oil that was beneath the surface. We could talk about the massive oil mats that are being found beneath the surface that nobody talks about. They're not visible from the surface, but I was glad Mr. Graves raised this issue, because if we're going to commemorate this important milestone, we need to be honest about it. We can't whitewash the full consequences of our unhealthy reliance on big oil and the inherent dangers of some of these drilling operations. Now, I know that the minority would like to have that be the narrative today, how far we've come, how safe drilling and exploration is, because obviously there's an agenda to take drilling and exploration into the Arctic, onto the Atlantic coast. But we need to think very carefully about that and make sure that we're drawing the right lessons from our own very recent history. So, Mr. Salerno, Director Salerno, I just want to ask you about the Arctic, for example. Would you agree that the Arctic is probably one of the more hostile climates that we could attempt to do oil exploration and drilling in?
It is a hostile environment. It's not impossible, but it would require very special considerations and capabilities to be brought to the scene.
Yep. Choked with pack ice 8 months of the year, 25-foot seas, gale force winds, a lack of nearby equipment and staging locations. All of these things are going to seriously complicate an attempt to do drilling in a place like the Arctic. Wouldn't you agree?
I liken it to a moonshot. You really have to bring what you need with you,
Yeah.
which gets to the whole question about the relief rig, and it also gets to the special capabilities of the equipment that's brought to the scene.
Right. Now, Shell Oil Company tried to get into that area in August of 2012, and it's my understanding it didn't go so well. Are you familiar with that effort?
I am.
Would you tell us a little bit about what went wrong?
There were elements of the overall operation which did not pan out as Shell had planned. The environmental response capabilities were not brought to bear. That resulted in a restriction in what drill was allowed to do in their drilling activity. They were not allowed to enter into an oil-bearing zone as a result. And then, as it was well publicized, the marine transportation portion of their operation failed on bringing the rig out of the Arctic. This actually occurred down by the Aleutian chain, where they lost the tow line and were unable to recover the tow.
Now, they had an underwater containment vessel that they claimed could bottle up a gusher. What happened to that?
That was not functional, and that was the reason they were not allowed to drill into an oil-bearing zone. They did not have that capability readily available.
And they had 2 drilling rigs that they lost control of. One of them crashed on the rocks and had to be rescued by the Coast Guard. Is that your understanding as well?
I believe they did drag anchor. They did have some marine problems, and the Coast Guard addressed those.
All right, thank you. I think we need to be very careful before wishfully assuming that everything is safe with oil exploration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Dr. Murawski. The 5-year anniversary of this horrific oil spill has brought us some very slick television ads from British Petroleum showing healthy wildlife and pristine waters, talking about the unprecedented mitigation efforts, suggesting that all is well in the Gulf. But what we don't see are pictures of a place such as Cat Island, Louisiana, and I have a poster here too. One is before the Deepwater Horizon spill on the left, so what you see there is a well-vegetated barrier island providing all sorts of ecosystem and hurricane safety services for that area. And on the right, what you see is a completely devegetated and actually shrunken barrier island that has reduced in size because all the vegetation was killed. The vegetation was holding the land in place, and it's begun to erode and literally disappear before our eyes. Could you speak to this and perhaps some other barrier island impacts that we don't see in those slick BP TV commercials?
Thank you for the question. I haven't been to Cat Island specifically, but I have spent a considerable amount of time in Barataria Bay and places like Bay Jimmy, where, as Mr. Gray said, the oil still exists. One of the phenomena we see there is that most of this oil exists a few feet into the marsh. And what's happened over time is because of the toxicity of the oil, it actually kills the roots of the marsh grass. And the roots of the marsh grass are basically a matrix that keeps the land in place. And so we've seen accelerated erosion off of those marshes as the marsh grass has died back. And that certainly is occurring in those places where it's most oiled and probably occurring on these barrier islands as well.
And when you see offshore islands like this literally disappearing because of that erosion, what does that mean in terms of storm surge and potential impacts from events like hurricanes?
Well, honestly, you know, when we talk about the role that the natural world plays in environmental protection, and particularly hurricane protection, the so-called green infrastructure, this has been a very effective way to mitigate the effects of storm surge over time, and we've seen land use practices that have defeated that. We can assume that if this is the cause, that would accelerate the loss of this and degrade the green infrastructure protection that we see in storm surge.
Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in something I read about just in the last week. There, in the wake of Hurricane Ivan, an offshore platform owned by Taylor Energy in the Gulf was toppled because of a subsurface mudslide. Apparently, the apparatus down there was buried in so much sediment that even now, more than 10 years later, it's still leaking, and neither the industry nor federal officials nor anyone else has any idea really at this point how they're going to stop it from leaking. I believe it's one of the longest running oil spills that we've ever seen, and recent data suggests that the volume of what has spilled is 20 times higher than the figure originally put forward by Taylor Energy. What would be the consequences of an event like this, which of course the industry would like us to believe is no longer possible, but if it were to happen in a place like the Arctic, what would be the consequences given how hard it would be in a difficult location like that to deal with an undersea leak in a very remote location?
I'm familiar with the Taylor situation there, and of course what that is providing is a chronic moderate level exposure that is out in the environment, and as you said, the circumstances are so difficult it's almost impossible to deal with. In terms of the implications for an Arctic spill on those lines, the Chukchi Sea is a very difficult place, even without the drilling, and so the effects of a long-term spill like that would be probably devastating to the wildlife and the subsistence livings that people make on the North Slope.
Great. Thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.